Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles. I'm the host of the Angelo Robles podcast on Stitcher, iHeart, Apple, and Spotify, and the founder and CEO at FamilyOffice Association. I have a very, very fortunate and very special guest with us today, and a topic that I just love that many of you know this summer. With many of my Zooms and my podcasting, we've been focused around this issue because it's such an incredibly important one for families. Today, it's titled, How Not to Lose a Fortune, Families Managing Through Transitions. While change is constant, wealthy families often underappreciate the risk inherent in important family transitions. Some transitions are common to all families: births, deaths, marriages, sometimes divorce. Yet affluent families face higher stakes challenges. Others are unique to ultra-wealthy families, including the sale of a business, generational succession, leadership transition in the family office, and ever-present family litigation. Our special guest today is Paul Morelli, founder and managing partner of Vernal Point Advisors, a firm that was established to guide wealthy families through important high-stakes transitions, including transitions that culminate in the launch, breakoff, or restructuring of a family office. Paul, welcome to the show.
Angelo, thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on. There are some people that I call kind of go-to resources globally, not even domestically, but really globally in the community on big picture issues, on tax issues. I probably have a stash of about 20 of them, and I'm very fortunate. Paul, for sure, is one of them. And Paul, I find your model to be incredibly unique. I can't say that I really know anyone quite like you, which is, trust me, I hope a compliment. How did you arrive at your current business model? If you could explain it to the audience, please.
Sure. Well, like any entrepreneur, I wanted to understand where there was an unmet need that I could develop a strong competitive edge in addressing. And my background was setting up and running family offices. And I realized that there was a shortage of family office professionals because the need for family offices was growing much more rapidly than the stock of professionals, in part because many of them were older and retiring. And multifamily offices have a lot of issues implementing a single family office service model. So I decided to set up a business that would help families launch single family offices. The catch was that I didn't want to replicate the multifamily office issue where outside capital creates a conflict of interest. So the question I asked myself is how I could self-fund the business without exposing too much of my capital. The idea I struck on was to become a specialist in ultra high net worth transitions because they are high stakes. I cannot find excellent generalists out there, just many discombobulated specialists like lawyers and accountants who knew certain types of transitions, but not others, but who couldn't see the whole picture. And we realized if a family doesn't have a family office, they don't have an inbuilt team to manage transitions. So the idea was to build my family office practice off of a transition consulting practice. And that's pretty much how it's turned out. We've managed 4 to 5 transitions a year. And out of those 4 to 5 families we work with, 2 become long-term family office clients. And of course, once they're our clients, then they have their own transitions pretty regularly. So in the last 8 years, we've managed over 50 transitions for our clients.
And as I explained to everyone leading into today's podcast, we're doing this in a little different format. It's going to include a presentation format, including a brief PowerPoint by Paul. Yes, we do understand those that will be calling in or will listen to this. It's not quite as interactive from that perspective, but Paul is very descriptive. So even if you're not visually seeing it, it will still be of value. We will for sure engage our live audience today. So we do encourage you to ask questions and be interactive. And then once Paul goes through the presentation and 3 core points, I will also dive in with a series of questions that I'm going to have. So it's kind of a hybrid model. It's great to change things up. It gets a little stale doing, and I do these every day, doing only Q&A. And Paul is just so good at what he's doing. Paul, why don't I put it in your hands now in terms of diving into the certain categories of the transitions that you'll initially cover in your presentation.
Sure. Let me screen share so we have a visual prompt as well.
Of course.
Okay. Are you seeing that?
It's all good. All right.
Okay, great. Well, first, let me apologize for the unprofessional Zoom background, but we have apocalyptic smoke conditions here in California. I actually included a slide of my view this morning.
Wow.
It's only become darker since then. It's almost pitch black here at 11 in the morning. But this just is a reminder that some events occur that aren't that predictable. Transitions are, of course, both varieties. And today I'm going to focus just on 3 categories of transitions, because there are at least 6 or 7 that we've gotten experience in, but there's only enough time for really 3. And then at the end, I'll open up a Q&A for other types of transitions that I didn't cover. The first one I'll start with is family office transitions, because the approach we took to this particular type of transition is actually portable to other types of transitions. So family offices are often viewed as single institutions that have a lot of employees focusing on one family. And we realize that that's not necessarily a model that is flexible. And we've had to help launch family offices from many different starting points. One of these starting points is just a de-novo launch. And that either happens when a family has a liquidity event and has built no family office to date and decides to build a full-scale family office. Another very common one is someone is creating wealth at a rapid rate, let's say a GP of a private equity firm, and they just need ever-growing services. And so we have a 10-year roadmap to build a family office. Those are the de-novo launches, but also very common. I'd say about half of our family office launches are actually breakaways from either a family office that's embedded in a corporation that grew without design, and either the family has realized it's not working or they sell the corporation. And then the other 2 are generational or branch separations. And the branch separations in particular can be acrimonious. Sometimes they're friendly, often they're hostile. At least 2 of the launches we've done, the actual separations are litigated. So that certainly adds a few twists. The other thing that's interesting is that family offices, once they are in existence, they evolve a lot, at least the good ones do. There are quite a few that don't evolve. There's rigidities in the way they're designed, and they become obsolete or the family becomes unhappy with them. But the common reasons for evolution are there's a change in leadership. Family members have changes in relationship with each other. That's actually quite common. And of course, there are changes in circumstances, whether wealth or external or the markets. Many different things can drive a change in the family office. The approach we developed is to conceptualize the family office not as one institution, but as a value chain that is executed across many different institutions and individuals. The idea is to sit down with the family, understand what their goals and circumstances are, then develop a strategy for achieving their goals, convert that strategy into a specific plan. Once a plan is laid out, the key to this whole process is you allocate those different functions to different individuals and institutions in a way that's most appropriate for the family and allows a lot of flexibility and adaptability as the family changes. Whether it's a planned change, such as growing wealth, or it's an unplanned change. And the last thing I'll say in terms of building this team, making sure everyone's a true partner in their orientation is critical. You need economic alignment as well. And if you don't have strong alignment between these disparate institutions or individuals, you actually don't have a well-functioning team. But if you can set that up, you end up having a very flexible, essentially single family office service architecture, usually at less than half the cost of a typical family office. I created some visual schematics just to help drive this home. There are essentially 4 groups that execute family office functions in a typical one of our clients. One group is the family. Another group is our internal professionals. The third group is the family's employees. And then the 4th group is external professionals and vendors. And the degree in which a family runs their own family office versus outsourcing it to us and the rest of the team varies. And I have schematics showing 3 different points on that continuum, but what shifts along these continuums is who is actually doing the functions, one, and two, who's in charge of the executive oversight to manage the entire value chain. Some of our clients completely outsource the family office functions to us, are involved in managing their own lifestyle and maybe creating their wealth, but that's it. And as they become wealthier or more proactive, they start to step in and co-manage the family office, add in more of their employees. They hire employees, we help hire them, we help train them. And as they get fully institutional, typically when they cross $1 billion plus, sometimes even more than that, then they actually are probably insourcing 2/3 of the functions. There are still external professionals, as you always need, and we play a much more specific role consulting or delivering an integrated vertical, such as integrating investment and tax strategies. But the main point is that it's a very flexible architecture that can evolve with a family. And this same approach of allocating functions after you develop the strategy actually transports very well to other transitions. We view family office management as just as a series of transitions that need to be managed. So this architecture actually works for other transitions as well. And I won't belabor the process, but it is a cycle as you start with discovery and you end up recalibrating the goals and circumstances, you're understanding them at the end of the process as well, and restarting the process. So it never really stops when you run a family office, and that's a little different from a discrete transition like a divorce, but the steps pertain to both types of transitions. Okay, the three transitions that I'm covering today are family office transitions, which I just covered, marital transitions, and then intergenerational transitions. And I picked the latter two because they are very high stakes and typically very emotional, but also very novel. You don't, unless you're unlucky, go through multiple prenups or divorces. And generational transitions occur once every generation. So there's not much of an embedded body of knowledge out there for families to tap. So I wanted to just provide some high level insights from it and some tips for families how to navigate. I will allow a Q&A at the end of each section to answer more detailed questions about the section just covered. And I'll start with opening it up to the audience right now to see if there's any questions about family office transitions, even though I kept that rather topical.
And I'm taking a look. It's Angelo, everyone, at the Zoom chat feature with a presentation going on. So it's a pinch more complex, but it does not look like a question has come in yet. In terms of what you just covered prior to you getting to marital, I'm going to have a question or two, but maybe I'll just save them until the end after you're finished with your three sections. But there's something that struck an interesting chord with me, but why don't we wait until we go through the sections? And if I have a couple of questions, I will pounce on them at that point.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you. There are three types of transitions that involve family law. One is prenups, then there are postnups, and then divorces. The main message I have about prenups is that they're very good because they avoid generally the need for a complicated divorce or acrimonious divorce, and they certainly can avoid the need for postnups. Prenups should be addressed with a lot of attention because they are usually the biggest financial transaction of your life, especially if you're early in your wealth creation arc. And as uncomfortable as it can be, just understand that if this isn't the biggest financial transaction in your life, divorce will be, in 50% chance that you do have a divorce. But also, if you're not comfortable having a discussion about a prenup, that's not necessarily the best sign for the odds of your marriage. And things will get a lot more fraught later. So it's a worthwhile conversation to have with the guidance of professionals who've been through this. The other thing to note is a prenup tends to be a lot better, not just because it eliminates risks. It's occurring at a time of maximum goodwill and trust between imminent spouses. A divorce, there is no trust and there's typically no goodwill, except maybe in 15 to 20% of the cases. So that's something to bear in mind. Tips that I would give you for navigating a prenup: don't rely on it exclusively. Their asset structuring, trust structuring, if you are owning a business, operating agreements, all can be a complementary premarital planning. If you must and cannot do an actual prenup, trust structuring sometimes is the second best, but it's certainly imperfect. Also, don't hesitate to include in trust that you structure for your children that their access might be limited unless they have premarital agreements. That actually takes some of the awkwardness away of having that discussion with spouses when you say, I cannot tap my wealth, which you'll benefit from, unless I have a prenup, so I'm sorry we have to go through this process. The second thing to note, and this may matter less for families that are deeply grounded in the States, but many of our clients are global in their footprint because they're so wealthy, they have houses and family everywhere. But that your jurisdiction can change. And that's true even in the States. You may start in California and then move to Pennsylvania. And the laws in Pennsylvania are completely different from California. In California, you have community property. In Pennsylvania, you don't. So as you build your prenup and complement it with this other structuring, you should be aware that your jurisdiction can change. And particularly if you know that you're going to make this change, talk to a family law professional. And even after your marriage, if you have a prenup and you know you're going to make a change or exploring it, talk to a family law professional in that state. The last point I would make is that family law attorneys really, really differ. There's a lot of differentiation between them. Some are custody experts. Some are acrimonious adversarial attorneys. Some are collaborative. There is a subset that actually focuses on prenups and postnups. And they're typically a lot less adversarial in their nature. They have a disposition, they don't like to fight. They're constructive and they have a lot of experience crafting prenups and postnups and also cleaning up messy postnups that haven't worked. So that experience makes them better at crafting prenups. And they typically can actually refer you to other attorneys who are good constructive prenup attorneys to introduce your spouse to, because your spouse has to be represented in order for your prenup to be effective later. The other thing that you have to do is you have to have complete disclosure. And this is where my firm often would come in to help families is either their existing clients or their ones about to go through prenups. We help them have very thorough and complete disclosure, while at the same time helping them pick attorneys, helping them do all the other premarital structuring that's required. I'll move on to postnups. Now, postnups are the most delicate type of transition. And because a divorce, the decision has already been made. I think we've only had one divorce that got non-suited in my career. So they're very rarely reversed once they start. Prenups, of course, there's an opportunity for them in every new marriage. But postnups can be popped on someone unexpectedly. One we see about 30% of the time, it's actually estate planning, and not just tax optimized estate planning, but just essential estate planning that triggers the need for documented identification of separate property. That sometimes leads to the question of like, whose property is this? It's in joint name, but maybe it's mine, maybe it's yours. Tracing rules determine that as well as whether you're in a community property state or not. But there can be many triggers, so this is something you should bear in mind as a potential impact to you if you don't already have a postnup in place. Another trigger we see, because a third of our client base is professional investors, is they're not allowed into a partnership sometimes unless they have a postnup in place. And sometimes the partnership will put language in the document not letting a spouse or an ex-spouse control any share of the partnership. But other times they actually require a full-on postnup if you want to join. And if you're joining an elite GP, you probably will go through it. So it's an awkward trigger. The other thing that makes them very dicey is you're handling an intact marriage, but one that's under strain, even if it's not triggered by discord. And that's probably only 30% of the cases. Usually some sort of discord or stress has already started before the process begins. You can still create a big strain, and there's three reasons. One is that you have to provide complete disclosures. And if you're wealthy and you inherited your wealth, or you made it prior to marriage, you may have a lot of separate property, even in a community property state. But in a postnup, you have to disclose everything. It's even worse than death. You think death and all the disclosures of an estate tell you everything. Actually, divorces are even worse. It is absolutely every single detail of your financial life, including any sort of business arrangements you may have. What sometimes can happen is you can see that a spouse is spending on, for instance, a child from a former marriage, which causes strains or just raises questions when people were acting privately with the best of intentions. Now there's a feeling that a trust has been betrayed. So that's common. The other is that couples, whether in a structured manner or informal manner, develop a type of operating agreement for the way they handle finances in their marriage. Who pays taxes, who pays what bills, other such things. And a postnup actually requires you to formalize much of that. In fact, all of it. So if you had an informal agreement or detente, it actually can now have to be renegotiated, and it opens up a lot of issues. And remember, you have both parties having lawyers on their side who act like fiduciaries and feel legally obligated so they don't get sued to point out all the ways you're giving up something you don't have to give up. So the lawyers antagonize an already complicated process, even when they're good lawyers who aren't trying to do that. The final point is that a postnup is actually a negotiation for a prepackaged divorce. Should you get divorced, the postnup drives how that will happen. And that adds yet one layer of complication to everything, particularly because as tensions rise in a postnup situation, the specter of divorce looms ever larger. And so those are the three reasons postnups are very tense. I'll say, though, it can be positive too if there has not been an effective way to govern how they share their joint financial lives, but be aware that there's a strain. And my tips lead directly from that insight. First is that I'll just reiterate that prenups are much less risky to a relationship because of the point of maximum goodwill, and there's no disruption of existing relationships. There are also lawyers who specialize in postnups. Going to a general family law attorney who's used to divorces, they tend to be super antagonistic or super, they call it fiduciary, but really just aggressive. And they don't care too much if it goes into a divorce. They get a lot more billable hours. So those are not the type of attorneys you want. The attorneys that only do postnups and refuse to support a divorce, should a postnup drive into that, that's the one that has the right alignment of interests. The last point I'll make is that there are additional professionals on the team to the lawyer. The forensic accountants are ones, the financials, as they call them, which are financial advisors, are the others. It's very important that they're committed to the business and that they aren't overcommitted in terms of having too much capacity. Working with a top lawyer lets that lawyer command your other professionals' attention, because the lawyers determine who gets business. And if they don't get good service, that they won't keep giving business to these other professionals. So making sure that your whole team is not overcommitted is critical, because these postnups, I've seen some linger on for 4 years, sometimes ending in divorce, sometimes not. But it's stressful, and the longer it goes on, the higher the risk of divorce goes. And of course, all the bills go up as well. Okay, so if you end up getting divorced and postnups and prenups didn't work, the thing to bear in mind that there is no justice and there's no fairness in the system. There's only family law. And family law is its own beast. I did not know this when I started consulting in this area, but it's pretty much an entirely different legal system, different set of judges. The normal principles of law just don't seem to pertain. And just like any process that often involves litigation, there's a lot of unpredictability. There are also set formulas that are followed, for instance, for child support, which may be counter to what both parties agree to, but is required by the state. So be aware, completely different set of rules. What you think is normal or fair is not. And if you're thinking about a divorce, investigate what it involves and the risks to you. The other caveat is you have to be wary of the professionals in this field, particularly that you have to manage them. First point is that they're overstretched. So you see them burn out, you see them leave for 3-week vacations, not respond to you. And because many of them don't actually need to work to get business, there's just too much demand on their time already. They don't prioritize client relationship management. You won't be communicated to thoroughly. You will not be respected. It's certainly going to add to your stress. So that's a major issue in this field. For lawyers in particular, the billable hours model creates pretty significant conflicts of interest. You have to shop carefully to make sure these aren't lawyers who like to paper things up, disturb discord, and be antagonistic, because it increases their billable hours. And unfortunately, if your significant other gets one of these lawyers, it increases the cost for you, even if you have one who's not antagonistic. But having one who isn't does help prevent further escalation. The other thing we see lawyers do is they delegate financial work that truly a financial advisor should do sometimes even a forensic should do, to junior associates who don't have the appropriate training, but since the partner delegating the work will get 60% of the revenue to them that their junior associate gathers with their hours, they have a conflict. The final caveat I would say, and the reason we got into this business, because this is actually the first transition line that we got into, is that we realized that the financial advisors that kind of hover around the divorce world don't understand ultra high net worth divorce. And at least 2/3 are simply RIAs trying to get pipeline for their business. So they're not dedicated to the business. Their successes don't hinge on doing well in this field. They really are just trying to make it a sales process. And even the ones who are dedicated to it, most just aren't used to dealing with extremely wealthy families who have trusts and family dynamics, charitable entities, weird assets. So their ability to advise is poor, and that's really important because forensics can't, and lawyers, I don't want to throw any more shade on lawyers today, but many of them are not financial in their mentality. Many cannot operate an Excel even remotely well. So it's important to have a good financial on your team, and they're usually the hardest ones to find. As far as tips, prepare. It's the last thing anyone wants to pay attention to is a divorce because it's very painful to think about and go through, but preparing carefully for it, asking around, interviewing professionals, doing your research. I can't say how important having the right team is in this situation and making sure they're not overcommitted. The two emotions you're going to feel the most are fear and anger. Anger is usually just a way to deal with the high level of fear, but also is natural when your counterparty is acting irrationally. A friend of mine describes it as temporary insanity. And so choosing a lead lawyer who has a reputation of de-escalating matters for you, talking you off of ledges, but also not antagonizing the other side is very important. But a lawyer who can keep you calm and focused is very important. A caveat I gave you earlier about jurisdiction shopping, be aware that it can work against you, but also if you're thinking that a divorce may be a risk, just think about moving. I know spouses who have moved and pulled things into another jurisdiction, and that jurisdiction has much been favorable to them. The other thing you can do is you can actually qualify to file in multiple jurisdictions, and you can choose the one that you want that gives you a home court advantage. Finally, most people think divorce is one process. There are actually 3 different types. There's mediated, collaborative, and adversarial. Learn the differences. Collaborative is probably the lowest risk, followed by mediated. If those fail, then you can always go to adversarial. But if you start in adversarial, it's usually the most expensive and slow. So I will stop there since I covered a lot of ground and open it up for Q&A.
I do see one chat question, Paul, and by the way, that was fantastic, incredibly valuable and very helpful. It goes back many years, but once before, I did have probably the most prominent and diverse attorney in Greater Greenwich in this area on, and it was very unfortunately needed, but there is nuances, prenup, postnup, and all of that, so great insight. The question that came in from a live participant, Paul, can you share your observation about the success of postnups? Do they often clarify the financial partnership, or can they lead to divorce? Is the divorce less acrimonious if the postnup has been agreed to?
Okay, there's a couple of questions in there. I would say that postnup certainly can lead to a divorce process, and it's reminds me of finance a bit. There's no certainty. It's a calculated risk. There's other times where it's just required, and because of the antagonism that sometimes arises from the legal team in particular, and the fact that the legal team just goes home and they're in different houses, and the spouses have to go home and be in the same house, so the negotiations never stop. Sometimes you're talking with each other, sometimes you're lawyers, but it takes over the life, so it pushes up the risk. That said, sometimes it becomes clearer that a divorce will happen through this process where the risk becomes higher. Actually, following through with the postnup process ends up creating a prepackaged divorce that is considerably de-risked and often cheaper. So a postnup actually can turn into a divorce process in a positive way, and it can turn into a divorce process in a very negative way. It's hard to predict, but I know that the professionals who specialize in postnups are very careful with the thought that they are handling an intact marriage, and they do not want it to go into a divorce. If you go with an attorney who is a generalist or actually does a lot of litigated adversarial divorces, the chances of it actually turning into a divorce are much higher in my experience. I hope that sufficiently answers the question.
I believe it does. There's other questions that are coming in. Let me absorb it and read it to you. Paul, what about when there is a split within a family? Next gen sibling split from a family office or a trust? What have you seen with illegal separations when spending a year trying to separate from a trust to no avail? Now, before you answer, that may be part of what you're next going to talk about in intergenerational transitions. If you'd like to tee that up or answer it, I'll post that part of the presentation. That's your call.
Well, it will be addressed in the next part of the presentation, but it's also a good bridge, and we can continue to answer questions. But the reason it's interesting is that in a family office, the situation described there is it's usually not the family member who chose to be tied at the hip with this other family member or the trust or the broader family office. It's sometimes imposed through trusts. Now, in a marriage, at least you're choosing your partner, but you cannot choose your family members. And you have to be aware that the professionals selling you services like pulling all the money into an LLC or getting into trust for tax benefits aren't really thinking about dispute flashpoints that they're creating. They're selling a different type of service. So yeah, we see a lot of litigated splits, and it's very unfortunate. And the best lawyers I've seen are the ones who used to be litigators in family law and realized that their own work was causing these disputes, and they've switched and become counselors who don't actually draft the documents, but consult other lawyers and families to make sure that the governance structures built will not cause disputes later. But you're going to have to go through that process, and you should be aware if you're trust structuring that you are creating a lot of possibility for foment, in part because families think of themselves sometimes as families, but the reality is it's a bunch of individuals, and a pool of assets that has a set of individuals with different circumstances, different life experiences, and different goals just means that money will be managed suboptimally for everyone, generally. Sometimes it's managed optimally for one person and it makes everyone else unhappy. So we can, take the rest of this conversation to the next section, and I want to make sure to answer other questions that may come in on the divorce topic.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And the whole fiduciary issue with trust and leading to litigation, we all know that family dynamics are the number one reason why families don't sustain great wealth over generations. Taxes and investments could be a contributing factor, but effectively decisions that we make and family harmony and communication and all things that we've discussed in multiple other Zooms and podcasting with Dennis Jaffe, Dr. Stephen Rudin, and so many others over the years, yet nonetheless needs to be repeated again and again because these same mistakes are being made by so many. Kind of a question, it looks like it's a very brief one. I'll try to give it the right context. It basically says post-nup as a separation agreement, but it doesn't have a question mark or any other comment if you wanted to add your own commentary to it, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the first step is separation. And the reason you separate before divorcing is to set the clock for instance, if you're in a community property state, anything you earn is half your spouse's, but the date of separation then stops that from happening, and everything you earn thereafter is separate. So, a post-nup, at least I've never actually seen it, and I'm not a divorce attorney, so they may see other things. A post-nup is, I've never seen it actually form a separation agreement because the post-nup assumes you're not separated. And that may be because we mostly consult in community practice and community property states. So I don't know if there's more of a question there. I just don't ever see post-nups working as a separation agreement because financial affairs are thereafter separated, not joined. What's joined is, if you have children and then you need a co-parenting agreement And typically, and that's another point that I hadn't thought of, is that the dynamics of controlling your children often blow back on what you're doing with your finances. And then often one spouse will try to use financial negotiations as a way to get better access to the children, or vice versa. And so that's a very problematic dynamic when it happens. And if we are representing someone who starts to use emotional blackmail to get a financial end, or vice versa, we just disengage. But it's very common.
Yes, it certainly is. That appears to be the last of the questions for now. There may be others that come in towards the end if you wanted to, pardon the pun, but transition to the next point you're going to cover. We're all ready.
Sure. Okay. Generational transitions. Just to give you a little background on our experience here, 1/3 of the family offices we set up are approximately our next gens, and they're led by next gens. So that is a specialty we had. Prior to that, we spent a lot of years training, building custom education programs for next generation stewards, which is different from working with them for anywhere between, in one family's case, 9 years, helping them become stewards of the next family office, the one that has been reconceptualized and relaunched for their generation. So we have a ton of experience here. So I probably have even stronger opinions than I do around the divorces. And I'll jump into this and then leave time for questions, because it typically is a very how should I say, pertinent topic for almost every family office, inevitably. So generational transitions. The first idea is when it occurs at death. And sometimes this is completely unplanned. You have a wealth creator who just doesn't want a transition plan. They don't want to believe they can die. They have other reasons, and they die. And then you have a mess. So I am making this a small part of the presentation, but it's certainly very relevant for 15 or 20% of the families we work with. The first thing to note, particularly if you are one of these wealth creators, is that grief can very significantly impair the survivors, both cognitively and emotionally. If this is coupled with the key family member no longer being around to ask questions of, and no longer being able to make decisions, and often they're the only ones who actually have powers legally to make decisions, all sorts of issues can arise. Loss of wealth is probably the smallest of them. Loss of family unity is another big one. I've watched one situation where a father did not pre-plan, and his son had to handle the massive estate, which actually blew up his business partnership because he had a second job. And so that, just be aware of this dynamic. If you see it in your friends, it's worth highlighting. Of course, estate planning and governance strategies can help prepare for the death of individual family members. There's a concept that I haven't heard used a lot. One lawyer taught it to me, and then we started to expand it, which is called pre-administration. You go through, you act as if the principal or a key person died that day. And you go through like the game plan, and like you actually trying to think it out like a war game. What would happen? Can people still make decisions? Do assets get locked up? Is there all of a sudden a power struggle? Is the data here that we need? Can we keep managing the financial affairs? There's a lot of questions that come up. We've caught all sorts of strange issues, including realizing some people didn't have the citizenship they thought they did. And part of it is just business continuity planning. Every family office that's worth the salt is constantly going through business continuity planning. So the organization a good family office provides already eliminates a lot of these issues. You just turn it a couple extra notches and really just focus on this unique area of business continuity planning as a systematic way. The other concept we have is you do a mock administration. And the way that this is done is kind of what I explained, where you actually act as if someone had just died, but it's done by an external professional, not the family office staff. And they take you through the paces, and it's almost as if you're being asked an exam, say by an SEC examiner, what about this, what about that? And it lets an outsider share their perspective on how prepared you are. And of course, it can port over to a family member not just dying, but going into cognitive decline. Now, usually you've reached the spot, if it's one of the problematic cases, is because the key person is resistant to the process. I mean, it's painful even if they're not resistant to it, because this can take 2 years or longer. But if they are, it's usually because they don't like to contemplate death. And the message we found that actually works, and we're advocating on behalf of the next generation or the spouse who's the out spouse, is to let this key person know that they actually retain much better control of their future if they go through this process. Whatever their best laid plans are, if they haven't gone through this, a lot of errors can occur when they're not around to fix them. So that's been our experience in this type of generational transition. Preparation is everything. The other generational transition I want to talk about, since this is a family office organization, is a change in family office leadership. There are different leaders for the next generation. Now, of course, it's very different if you're on the 7th generation, as opposed to switching from generation 1 to generation 2. The latter case is far more risky. It's much more contentious, because when there is a wealth creator running the family office, or at least controlling it, if not leading it, they can change their mind. There are no governance conflicts. They tend to retain all the power. And for that reason, there's actually no governance structures necessarily in place, or no developed ones where the next generation can interact over in a low conflict manner. So when a transition occurs, there's 3 different ways the next generation of the family office can be led. What's pretty common is we see a family member somehow be singled out, either by their actions or by other family members, to lead the family office. It's usually most of the family members just don't want to, this is siblings really, don't actually want to run the family office or be involved. They're happier being clients so long as they feel that they have transparency. And the next generation offers an opportunity to really professionalize the family office. Now, I'll say we're seeing a subset of the whole universe, because people are approaching us because they want to professionalize it. I'm sure there are a lot of families where the next generation takes over, but they're not as intent as making it professional and fiduciary in its focus. But what's very common is that this individual does not start with a lot of credibility, unless it happens to be they're 40 and they made their name in business already. They're successful. They have the right training. They may have the credibility, but at least 50% of the time, the credibility isn't there. They're too young. They don't have the experience. Siblings are naturally skeptical. So they spend a lot of time having to develop credibility and keep expanding it. And they actually can't be effective in transitioning the family office until it's been built. So we spend a lot of time helping them build it. Last point I'd make, particularly when there's a single family member leading it, they may have the ability to lead, but it doesn't mean that they can't be undercut by other family members. You may have 2/3 of the family members not actively participating, but they can, effectively create a veto for a lot of things and cause a lot of hassle for the lead family member. So you do need to have good governance structures, even if you have a single person leading it. And that's for the next generation. As I pointed out, you don't necessarily need it for the first generation. Now, we've worked with a couple sibling pairs, we still do, who are jointly leading their family offices. Now, have not expanded that to 5 or 6 siblings at once. Where we've run into that situation, you still see only a couple really standing up and taking the lead. But it's much more fraught than a single leadership, because siblings do have rivalry and they have teddy bear issues, for lack of a better phrase, just they have a past and they have baggage that keeps popping up. And you see family dynamics driving the management of the family office, not economic logic. And they're walking into a situation where there's no pre-existing governance structure unless they're already on G3 of a professionally run family office. Now, everyone knows that pooled assets are a flashpoint for dispute. An even bigger one, or an exacerbator, is that there's no clear role definition. Now, in an enterprise, you may have much clearer role definition. A family member may be naturally talented at finance and will be the CFO. Another is an operator, they're in an operating role. There may be a fight for the CEO position one day, but there's a more natural role definition according to aptitude and age. For a family office, it's different. It seems like a much more open field, and people have different views of their capabilities. So power struggles are very common. The thing that family founders or family office founders forget is that when you trap family members into a family office and they can't opt out, the dynamics dramatically amplify. So it can be good, even though you want to keep the family together, to let them have a way out if they don't want to participate in the structure. That naturally makes the leaders of a family office, whoever it is, joint, single, or external, be much more fiduciarily oriented and much more communication oriented. For leadership transitions that transfer to professional outsiders as leaders, the thing to note, and the reason I started this whole business, is it's very hard to find really good, experienced, competent, and importantly, loyal, like psychologically loyal to family, external professionals. It can take easily a year. You should probably use specialized recruiters. It can take even longer. You certainly can easily make mistakes, and someone interviews well, they come in, and 6 months later, you find out they aren't as good as they think, or they just don't get along with a branch of the family. So the advice is start early. The other thing to note is once they're in, it can take 2 or 3 years for them to really learn the family system and dynamics, and having a kind of apprenticeship or journeyman experience under the tutelage of the existing leadership is very important. You also want to learn if they are truly loyal and committed to the families. That is one of the special things with single family offices. There can be a type of personal relationship that develops that leads to a high degree of alignment that's not economic. But to get this and to be certain that this is a stable and good transition, you should plan to have them in there for 2 to 3 years. Most families actually wait. They want to save money, or they don't want to make the transition, or they want to respect the sensitivities of the departing leadership. And they do it over a 6-month period, and it's usually just terrible. So spend extra money, get someone in 2 to 3 years. It'll help a lot. All right, I'll provide a few tips. I'm sure the first will be the most controversial, but if you're picking a family member or family members to lead, if they haven't distinguished themselves in terms of their level of motivation and preparation, give the job to someone else. They're not fit. They should apply for the job. They should show that they deserve it. The odds of them actually being deserving are low. I mean, certainly I can see why families would want a family member who has love for them being in charge of them. They feel a greater degree of comfort and trust. But if that's not consistent with the way that person has behaved up to that point or after they get the job, you have to be prepared to remove them and move to a different leadership structure. It's the biggest problem by far that we've seen, and it's incredibly hard, even with a great team of professionals, to bring a family office to excellence if you have someone in charge who's not truly stewardship oriented. In terms of training these individuals, and I'm talking about family members here in particular, one thing that we've done a lot and worked with a couple of external groups to do is to learn the situation as a technical specialist would, and then to build a custom designed training program so the family member stepping into it starts to learn what they need to know to manage their current affairs. Of course, it helps a lot if they actually have formal education like economics or business or something else, and on-the-job training is invaluable, but it's really a complement between these 3 different vectors of training. And it really is the responsibility of the current generation of leadership, because they're the only people in the position to actually understand what training is required, and they shouldn't leave it to chance. Oh yes, one last final point. External job experience helps a lot, both with credibility and with perspective. Giving a family member a job because they need one, and that job being run in the family office is terrible. It's usually something like a 90% failure rate if you do that. Whoever leads the family office, the most important thing we can say is don't forget to communicate. You're so enmeshed in running the family office, and every aspect of the financial lives of your family are second nature to you. It's easy to forget that it's obscure to everyone else. We actually train our partners who are running family offices to think like us, who's a commercial firm that can lose our clients in 10 days. Like, we have a 10-day notice period, so clients can leave us. And we have to train them to think that their family members can leave, so it's not taken for granted. If you do that, the communication program gets a lot better. When it's a joint leadership situation, I'll say all the other technical specialists around it, including us as financials or family office executives, lawyers, accountants, they don't necessarily understand family dynamics and systems and sibling rivalries and dynamics. There are a small number of professionals, some of who Angelo just mentioned, like Dennis Jaffe, it seems sometimes superfluous. It's striking how many of our clients and how many family offices we know don't spend a penny on this, but it's incredibly important, and there's no one else out there who actually has this expertise. Otherwise, everyone else is just winging it, including the family. Technical specialists also have another challenge. If you're using them as an advisor, they're very focused on creating value in the way they were hired for. So they'll create structures that create flashpoints later, like tying together family members for a tax benefit, and having tied family members together who have no other reason to have their assets tied together creates a lot of disputes. Ultimately, the thing I would leave you with here, and I got this insight from being posed this question from the leader of a family office, next gen leader. He said, what's the most important thing I can learn? And I had to think about that. And the reality is, and this loops back to the model we showed you earlier, is that partnering is an essential skill. And a lot of next gens don't know how to partner because they don't know how to pick partners. They don't know, they don't understand the idea of holding themselves accountable because they've been entitled to a lot. They don't understand how to manage partners. So the whole skill set of partnering is probably the most essential one to teach family members who will lead, in part because it's not taught in school. And it's ultimately critical because families will always depend on a whole team of professionals inside and outside the family office because everything is too complex otherwise, and partnering is a critical skill. So I'll stop there and first answer any questions about generational transitions, and then we can go into the bonus round if there's time.
Great. It looks like there have been some that have come in, and for sure, governance, how decisions are made is, I agree, shocking how many families don't have something more formal, or it hasn't been visited in, let's say, 20 years. In terms of what you just said relative to partnering, completely agree. I would recommend people to check out some of the latest books of Keith Ferrazzi. Many of you are familiar with, but he goes into collaboration, partnership that indirectly ties into family business and family offices, and some of his most recent work is fantastic. He's a well-known figure. There's a Q&A format that came in. It's more of a comment, but I'm going to read it. What Paul was describing was a fire drill, which every family member should consider, especially with next-gen family members. She continues, it was the single most important thing in our large family did, and allowed a lot of fears from generation 1 and 2 to be realized and addressed now when it's not too late. In consulting circles, what Paul may have described as kind of a stress test or a fire drill, sometimes we call it what's called a tabletop simulation. And it's really important, and sometimes they're a little uncomfortable. Sometimes when the family office is involved, they feel like you're trying to get them in a gotcha exercise, which you should not be doing. Everyone has blind spots. We need to get better. And it may not say much about the family office if they're only concerned about looking perfect all the time and not looking to get better. But we'll save that discussion for a different day. Paul, it looks like a question, perhaps two of them. I'm going to read the first one. It's a little long. How would you advise one branch of the family to consider a lift out from the family office? Some family members or branches feel like second-class citizens. Should they work to redefine governance and collaboration, or should they choose to unbundle and pull out from the rest of the family office?
That's a great question. We're at this moment in the final rounds of being recruited by a family for a multi-billion-dollar spin-off of a branch. And and the second-class citizens is a perfect example, a perfect way to describe what happens to a lot of branches. Particularly true for the ones who aren't in charge of managing the family office. And it may be because they were muscled out, or they were passive for a while, or they're the second generation of that branch and the generation above them wasn't active. And so as a result, because the family office professionals bear no real repercussions of bad service, they get bad service. So the question about whether you should go and talk to the broader family office and try to get better service, obviously their receptivity is part of it, but the first step would be to understand, in depth the goals that your family branch has, right? And that may not be that easy, because that family branch it can be described, depending on what generation you are, it could just be a couple, a husband and a wife, or even just one individual. But when you're in the third generation, that family branch is now 4 or 5 siblings, and they may not see eye to eye. And so, that has to be answered first. But starting with your goals, and then being able to map back to how your goals and the functions that need to achieve them are not being addressed by this family office, or being poorly addressed, is really where you start any conversation. And if you don't credibly believe that your family office can deliver on those, that's when you should consider breaking away. There are a variety of challenges when you break away, and you should be aware of those because it's a cost-benefit analysis. But one is just portability of data. That's a very common one. The second one is cost. And the people are most unhappy with the cheapest family offices. The reality is, and when they go off to break off their own family office, they're a little shocked at how much costs go up. So hard for me to give you a definitive answer on that one, but I tend to be a type of person who's not adversarial. So I first try to have a conversation in a very structured way with the family office, because that's the lowest risk and lowest cost way to do it. But sometimes it's just very clear it won't work, right? And then you just make the move.
There's another question. I'm going to read it. Let's assume G1 is in their 80s. What's their appetite for ESG? Do you see in generation 2 and 3 a greater appetite for ESG? And I suspect that could be pretty dramatic.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's the almost classic generational divide today in terms of investments. And, the generation that made the money is, I wouldn't say less idealistic. They're just more hardcore and skeptical, and they really want to do a show me thing, and they think it's hard to earn money and it's easy to lose it. And they sometimes view impact in particular. ESG is not so bad because there's a lot of evidence that you don't actually get worse returns there. But if you have, someone young and inexperienced going and approaching someone who made a lot of money and saying, hey, I have this like idealistic view of how I'm going to invest, it's usually met with a lot of skepticism. So, great preparation and evidence, and understanding that even if you make a compelling case and they don't buy it, you just have to walk away, is something that you need to prepare the next gen for. But the next gens have to just learn too that if they don't have control, try not to be too frustrated. Do what you can, but go on and try to live your life outside of what the family office can do. Typically, the pattern I see is you get a lot of focus, and there's of course logical reasons for this, by G2 or G3 on controlling joint financial assets, because it's obviously much easier to go and control a pool of $500 million of assets than it is to go out and become a GP after 15 years of trying, and then gather the same amount of money after 7 years of fundraising. It's a much easier thing to just try to win over grandpa's ear. But it can be a very destructive way of approaching your life personally if you're a next gen. I would say to build a bridge, besides establishing credibility that the approach will work, is to find common ground in terms of values. And if you don't have an alignment of values, nothing you can do in terms of technical communication will ever convince the next generation to change the way that they invest.
And it looks like there's another question that just came in. I don't have a chance to pre-read it, so let me just begin it. Are there any resources you can suggest for those wanting to unbundle or move out of the family office? She comments, there appears to be a lot of discussion about unbundling and moving from commingled family offices among families. Not a specific spoken about topic too much, needs to be addressed on a broader scale. And she notes it is an issue that many face, which I will concur is true.
It's a little difficult in the sense that we couldn't find a lot of resources when we were trying to get some background to build our model, right? So we've become that resource in many ways. And I think it's, finding someone who's, not necessarily us, but someone who's been in the family office world for a long time and understands how to define what you need is a critical starting point. And I think it's a different professional typically who can determine whether the governance and family dynamic, family relation aspects also, by themselves should tip the scales into actually making that transition. Now, should the decision be decided to be made, I think working with your lawyers and accountants and an outsourced family office executive or a friendly one, that's probably the three people you need to determine how to break away or whether you need to. Our firm is a little more full scale in the sense that I bring 6 or 7 people to a transition. There are at least 4 or 5 independent ex-family office executives running around there offering consulting services. So that's another resource. But the shortness of that model is that they can actually implement for you, and sometimes you need actually help implementing. It's not the whether you should do it, it's the very complex follow through, particularly if all members of the family who are breaking away have busy lives between families and work. You actually probably need to have a team built to help you do the transition.
Yeah, I mean, it's super complicated in the potential breakout, besides seeing if you can make it work and aligning values. If there's complexity with family trust and entities, if there's privately held real estate and assets, valuation, breaking that apart, there's no easy way to potentially do that, even if both sides agree that may end up being the best solution. But this is a topic that we could do a 6-hour masterclass on. It's a very rich and complex one, and unfortunately one that more and more families, from what I'm noticing, appear to be going through. Paul, I'm going to ask you a question, and while I'm asking Paul and he's responding, it's going to be a pretty deep question. Please feel free to throw a question in via the chat feature. We probably do need to wrap up in approximately 10 minutes, but again, we'll be as flexible as we can be. Paul, I did a solo video yesterday. It went up on my YouTube channel. So it's up there now, which is Family Office on YouTube. It's titled, I think I have it right, let's see. Working for the Super Rich, Fiction and Reality. So now you have context of the title, and you were hinting at this all along in your presentation, but I'll ask you. So you're correct. A wealth creator often is going to hire someone that they trust to some degree, is probably a contemporary of theirs, and that's going to be most common. Right or wrong, we could debate that because it's hard. It depends on how that wealth creator feels. But inevitably, for that family office to go to another level, it's going to have to be more rigorous, more professional, and more institutional. And you're correct. Sometimes that comes from the second generation that changes that whole dynamic of the family office, assuming it even gets that far. Most don't make it past that first generation for a variety of reasons. But the bigger picture leading to that solo video that I shot is you gave it from the perspective of the family member. And I agree with you. Everything you said was accurate, but I took the position of looking at it from the side of a talented executive that wants to work at an SFO or is recruited. And yes, you should always use top level family office experienced recruiters. But if they're really good at what they do, one, they have a job, they're making money, they have options. They may find it intriguing to work in a family office, but they don't need to. But let's talk about some of the realities of working in a family office. Often somewhat underpaid, overpromised and underdelivered. If you're not getting an agreement that specifies compensation and clarity on bonus or carried interest, then I'm sorry, you're going to lose the handshake agreement with someone who's worth hundreds of times more than you. Now, you hinted at the other. I'm going to make it a little uglier. And that is, especially if it's $1 billion family that should in theory be institutional, and the family office has a family member, even one, that is not qualified. Arguably, people may look at that person as being a so-called spy. It's going to create a terrible culture inside the family office. So I know one SFO executive who's very talented. Everyone would want this person. And they if I ever get approached by a family where there's a family member ingrained in the family office, I'm never going to say never, but 99% of the time, that's not going to be for me. And then you have the whole issue of you have a skill set, whatever, let's say it's investing, and you're doing things like, I want to build a golf course on my island. I want to buy an island. Oh, by the way, we don't have a receptionist when someone comes in. Do you mind getting them coffee? There's nuances to being in a family office with your ego, which should be zero, and the fact that you may do different things all the time. Now, some people are going to say, forget it, that's not for me. And great, I'm glad we put our cards on the table. But there are some people that like that like the fact that I don't know what next week is going to hold. Maybe I got to fly to Europe and buy an island off Greece, and I find that invigorating. I'm an attorney by trade. I like to negotiate. Why don't I stop there? And basically, that's the concept of institutionalizing and professionalizing the family office. Are you broadly seeing trends to higher level family offices above $500 million becoming more professional?
Yeah, the issue, yes, because there's a group like yours that are starting to build a body of knowledge, and families are now collaborating and learning from each other, which was not the case 15 years ago when I was running single family offices, right? So yes, there's a trend. There are pervasive issues that haven't gone away. One is the lack of career management. You go into a family office and you're being asked to do stuff that, helpful to the family, but not advancing your knowledge or helping you build a reputation. It's hard to have a next step. And of course, families as your sole clients and employers can determine how you move on. I'd say 25% of executives I know have had their career like practically shot in the head by a family who decided they were angry they were leaving, or some other reason. They basically undercut the career of these professionals. So as a professional, like having to deal with family dynamics, not actually being a partner because you don't have any independence, those are major issues. They're just the broader issue of there not being a lot of people who've grown up and developed careers in family offices. The ones who've been around for a while are retiring. So just like you have this issue in estate law where you go into an estate planning council meeting and you have a bunch who are 65 or older, and then you have some that are 40 or younger and none in between. There's a similar issue in the family office world. So professionalizing has become difficult because there are not a lot of professionals out there. Only recently have there been institutions that are trying to build that knowledge.
Yeah, there's a severe lack for a younger person of a career track and a chance to also expand your skill. If you're working in a big legal firm or a bank, you have unlimited resources, you're dealing with different people, you're getting different experiences. You may be too siloed, even in a billion-dollar family office. And if you're a high-flying direct deal person, is that family office going to be active in enough direct deals to keep you occupied, to keep you interested in your comp and carried interest? And how about if they have no interest in exiting deals for decades, but you're not at their level? So these are all very, very complex issues inside the SFO. And unfortunately, sadly, I have too many situations where, and they don't mean this in a negative way, but I pick up on it in a negative way. Angelo, I'm 60. I had a great career in legal. The family's pulling me in to run their family office. This will be a nice way to end the last 5 years of my career. Now, I know that means they're talented, they're trustworthy. That's all good. But to me, how I read that is I'm going to coast, just do enough of what I need to do, but I'm not, going after it, looking for best practices, expanding my skill set. That's really playing it safe. You're probably not going to hit a 2 out of 10, but you're certainly likely not going to hit a 9 or 10. You're probably accepting mediocrity at a 6 or 7. There's a book. Many of you have not heard of it. I'm going to recommend it. I just read it. It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek and a chuckle, but it does follow a kind of a consigliere / family office attorney for a multi-billion-dollar family who everyone would know, who passed away about 10 or 12 years ago. It's called Martini Wonderland. It's available on Amazon. Again, Martini Wonderland. It's It's a little bit of a riot. I got a chuckle out of it. And that kind of is what inspired me to shoot that video yesterday that I put up so quickly. I hope you all enjoy the book. I don't get nothing from it, but I loved it. I found one or two great nuggets in there. It does not look like there were any other questions as of yet in the chat feature. Paul, if you had to conclude in a closing commentary, what would that be?
Well, I would say that transitions don't get enough attention. And once we put that lens on of transitions and started to think of all the different ones, you start to realize that Family Office is a transition management machine. And, you know, designing it with that in mind actually gives it a lot more flexibility. And this concern about that has been voiced by a lot of people, including some people on this call, of having to break away, or 3 generations, the family office is defunct, could be addressed by having a more dynamic transition-oriented model, including planning for family members to leave the family office. And, you know, I'd probably leave it at that. There are a lot of other transitions out there. And the natural thing is for families and individuals to resist them. If you instead take the mindset that if it's inevitable, make the most out of it, or if you're actually proactive about triggering a transition or preparing for it years in advance, it can be a big opportunity. And I think that psychological resistance is usually the biggest challenge to good transitions, and it takes a while to change your mindset. So start the process.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And Paul and his firm are just amazing, and what a great resource. We highly encourage you to learn more and reach out. There is actually one company I know that effectively will help to finance if there's complexity and assets that make it difficult in valuation and liquidity, to help kind of just in that scenario. There's a fraction in the family. Is there an opportunity with a commercial entity to identify what the value of them would be to leave with no lawsuit and litigation, negotiate that settlement and make that happen? We'll likely have someone from that perspective on somewhere in the next 60 days, so just stay tuned. Paul, for those that would have an interest in learning about your firm, how could they learn more?
So you go to our website, www.vernalpoint.com, and there's contact information there, or I don't know if you shared my contact information in the emails you sent out, but either way, if they just reach out to either myself or Christy Keekler, our head of client relations, we will follow up.
Well, the more common way is they are going to hear it on a recording. If you don't mind repeating an email from yourself or Christy one more time.
Sure. Mine's PM, my initials, at vernalpoint.com. Or they can go to the website, www.vernalpoint.com, and they can find Christy's email or other partners' emails.
Excellent. That's fantastic. In wrapping up, everyone, I'm Angelo Robles. I'm the host of the Angelo Robles podcast and founder and CEO at Family Office Association, a global membership organization dedicated to families of wealth and their family offices, providing significant original proprietary content now more than ever. I would say hosting global programming. It's just digital, and I'm actually doing it way more than ever before, effectively a couple of 100 times a year. Today, I actually have 3. One is a peer-to-peer with an Australian group later on tonight at 8 p.m. So it's been a lot of fun. If you're not a member, we hope you look into membership. We're providing a significant amount of benefits and value added. And we do have some resources available on our new website, FamilyOfficeAssociation.com. As I mentioned, I highly recommend our YouTube channel. You could likely look it up by my name, but years ago, I got the great name to register it as simply Family Office. So that's my channel there. And you could reach me at Angelo@FamilyOfficeAssociation.com. Paul Morelli, thank you so much. Look forward to the next time. Thank you.